The locks changed without warning. That was the part that stayed with Noelle Carter long after everything else. Not the rain soaking through her coat, not the weight of 8 months pressing against her spine, not even the candlelight flickering behind the glass doors where her husband sat laughing with another woman. It was the locks. Damien Ashcroft hadn't screamed at her, hadn't served her papers, hadn't even looked her in the eye. He had simply changed the locks on a Wednesday while she was working a 12-hour shift keeping other people alive, and let her figure out the rest standing in the freezing dark. She pressed her palm flat against the door. He didn't look up. Vivian Laurent did. She smiled. If you've ever been erased by someone who once promised to protect you, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens next will shake you to your core. And if this story moves you, hit that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this has traveled. Subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Because what those four brothers did when they found out, nobody saw it coming. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, the kind of Chicago November rain that didn't announce itself dramatically, but simply arrived and stayed, soaking through everything gradually until cold became the only thing a person could feel. Noelle had worked the 7 to 7 shift at Mercy General, 12 hours on her feet in the maternity ward, which struck her later as either deeply ironic or simply cruel, depending on what kind of mood she was in when she thought about it. 8 months along, ankles swollen inside her compression socks, back aching in that dull, persistent way that had become background noise over the past several weeks. She'd declined the offer from her supervisor, Janine, to cut her shift short. Declined twice, actually. She didn't want to go home early. That should have told her something. The cab dropped her at the end of the private drive because the gate sensor wasn't responding to her code. She assumed it was a glitch. The system had been temperamental since the last software update Damien's security team had installed. Expensive equipment that nonetheless managed to malfunction at spectacular moments. She typed her code again. Nothing. Pulled out her phone to call Marcus, the night guard, and found that his number had been removed from her contacts list. She stood there for a moment in the rain trying to understand what she was looking at. Her own phone. Her own contacts. His number simply gone. She walked the perimeter to the side entrance, the one near the kitchen that she'd always found slightly embarrassing. That particular entrance that was used by staff, by delivery people, by anyone who wasn't supposed to use the front. Her key didn't work there either. She tried it 3 times, turning it carefully. Both directions the way you do when you're certain the problem is technique and not the fact that the lock has literally been changed. The kitchen light was on. She could see it through the frosted glass panel beside the door. Someone was inside. She knocked. Nobody came. She knocked again, harder this time, and then heard footsteps. Elena's footsteps. She recognized the pace. And then nothing. Just silence and the sound of rain. Elena Morales had worked in that house for 6 years. She had brought Noelle chamomile tea without being asked during the early weeks when morning sickness made the smell of almost everything unbearable. She had once sat with Noelle at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning when Noelle couldn't sleep, and they had talked for almost an hour about absolutely nothing. Elena's niece's quinceañera, a recipe involving plantains, the particular way Chicago light looked from the kitchen window in early spring. Elena didn't open the door. And that silence, was the moment something cold and specific moved through Noelle's chest that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. She made her way around to the front of the house. The main entrance, the one with the tall iron doors and the security camera mounted above the frame that Damien had once pointed to when they were first dating, half joking, half serious. Nobody gets in without me knowing. The doors were locked. Through the long vertical windows flanking the entrance, she could see into the foyer. The marble floors she had spent 3 weekends choosing, the lamp in the corner she'd found at an estate sale and had rewired herself because she liked the shape of it, the small painting her mother had given her that she'd hung near the stairs. It was all still there, every object in exactly the same place, as though she'd simply stepped out for a while, as though she would be allowed back. She moved past the foyer windows toward the dining room, and that was when she saw them. Damien was at the head of the table. He'd changed into a charcoal shirt she didn't recognize, and he was leaning slightly forward in the way he did when he was relaxed, genuinely relaxed, the particular looseness in his shoulders that she had once believed only she could produce in him. Candles on the table, 2 glasses of wine, and Vivian Laurent in the chair that Noelle had sat in every night for 2 years, laughing at something he'd just said with her head tilted at an angle that suggested familiarity, comfort, The easy rhythm of two people who had been sharing the same space for a long time. Noelle put her hand on the glass. She didn't know she was going to do it. Her palm connected with the window and she held it there, and for a moment she simply watched, because some part of her brain was still processing, still trying to construct an explanation that made logical sense. A business dinner. An emergency meeting. Vivian was his attorney, after all. There could be documents, strategies, something urgent requiring this particular setting on this particular evening. Then Damien reached across the table and touched Vivian's hand. Not a handshake. Not a professional gesture. The kind of touch that meant something had already been decided, already settled, and whatever it was, it had nothing to do with legal strategy. Noelle's palm slid down the glass. She found herself sitting on the front steps. She didn't remember deciding to sit. The concrete was wet and cold through her coat, and she was aware, dimly, that sitting on cold concrete for any length of time was probably not the wisest decision given that she was 8 months pregnant in November in Chicago. But the awareness felt distant and unimportant compared to the thing that was happening in her chest. This specific compression, like something structural had shifted, a load-bearing wall quietly giving way. She had been a nurse for 4 years. She understood the clinical language for what stress did to a body, what cortisol did, what grief looked like in vital signs and blood panels. She had held the hands of patients experiencing precisely this kind of news and had known exactly what to say, what tone to use, which silences to leave alone. She sat in the rain and had absolutely nothing to say to herself. Her phone rang. She looked at it. Her brother Mason's name on the screen. It was a Friday. Of course it was. Mason called every Tuesday and Friday, had done so since their mother died 13 years ago, had never once missed a call, had never once offered an explanation for the consistency as though the explanation were self-evident, which it was. She watched his name flash on the screen and then watched it stop. She couldn't answer. She didn't know what words she would use. She sat there for another 20 minutes, maybe longer, before the first contraction arrived. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing nobody told you. The first one rarely was. It felt like pressure, like her body tightening around a point of particular discomfort. And for a moment she told herself it was the cold, was stress, was the weight of everything pressing inward. Then it released. Then 4 minutes later, another one. She was a maternity nurse. She counted. She breathed. She pressed her hand against her abdomen and felt the baby shift slightly, a small rotation that had become familiar over the past weeks. And she said, very quietly, to no one, "Not tonight. Please, not tonight." The baby did not comply with the request. She was reaching for her phone to call an ambulance when the headlights came. Not one set. 4. Coming from different directions, from the private road, and from the adjacent street, and from the service route that ran along the east edge of the property. 4 black vehicles moving with a kind of purposeful coordination that wasn't accidental, wasn't coincidental, was the specific choreography of people who had talked to each other and made a plan. The vehicles stopped. The doors opened. Her brother Damon came out of the first one. Damon, 34, who had driven a city bus for 9 years and had hands like their father, and the same particular stillness their father had carried. The kind of stillness that wasn't peace, but was something you could easily mistake for it. Behind him, Marcus, 31, still wearing the jacket from whatever shift he'd just come off at the precinct, his badge clipped to his belt without him noticing, because Marcus sometimes forgot he was a detective when family was involved. Garrett from the third vehicle, 29, who had left a dinner half-eaten based on the way he was still chewing when he stepped out, who built things for a living and had the particular practicality of someone who understood that problems required tools and the right approach. And finally, from the fourth vehicle, coming around the front to where she was sitting on the steps, Mason. Mason was 26, the youngest. He'd been calling her every Tuesday and Friday for 13 years. He crouched down in the rain in front of her without saying anything. He looked at her face. He looked at her hand pressed against her abdomen. He looked at the locked door behind her, at the light coming through the dining room windows, at the 2 figures visible through the glass. He understood the complete situation in approximately 4 seconds. "Okay," he said. Just that. Not a question, not an exclamation, just okay, the way you say it when you're absorbing information, and the information is bad, but you're not going to fall apart because falling apart is not useful right now. "Mason." Her voice came out wrong, smaller than she intended, slightly broken at the edges. "I'm here," he said. "We're here." Damon was already on his phone. Marcus had turned toward the house with an expression she recognized from family dinners, when something had gone wrong and he was deciding how to respond to it, that particular stillness before action. Garrett put his hand on her shoulder briefly, checked something she couldn't see, then crouched down to her level and said, in his practical Garrett way, "How far apart?" 4 minutes, she said. Maybe 3.5. All right. He stood. We need to go. I'm not... She started to say something about the journal, about the boxes in the garage she'd seen stacked against the wall when she'd walked the perimeter, about her mother's handwriting on the cover of the one at the top. She stopped. What? Mason said. Nothing. She let him help her up. It's nothing. Let's go. They got her into the closest vehicle, Damon's, which was clean and warm and had a blanket in the back seat because Damon was the kind of person who kept a blanket in the back seat. And they drove toward Mercy General, and nobody in the car said anything about Damien Ashcroft or Vivian Laurent or locked doors or changed access codes. Mason sat beside her in the back seat with his hand near hers without quite touching it, offering the contact if she wanted it. She didn't take it. Not yet. She leaned her head against the window and watched Chicago move past in the rain. The streetlights reflected in puddles, the lit windows of apartments stacked above restaurants and laundromats and late-night pharmacies, the particular texture of the city at midnight in November when most people were inside and warm, and none of them knew what was happening in this specific car on this specific street. She thought about the dining room she'd just walked away from. The candlelight. The way Damien's shoulders had been relaxed in that specific way she'd once believed she alone could produce. She thought about the baby's name, the one she'd chosen 2 months ago and hadn't told anyone, not even Mason, because she'd been waiting for the right moment, had been hoping that moment would involve Damien. She understood now that moment was never going to come. Another contraction moved through her, and she gripped the door handle and breathed the way she'd coached 100 patients to breathe. And Damon accelerated smoothly through a yellow light, and Mason said quietly, "You're okay." She wasn't, not yet. But she looked at his face in the dark of the back seat, his 26-year-old face with their mother's eyes and their father's jaw, and the particular expression of someone who has been waiting patiently and without complaint for the specific moment when he would be needed. And she thought, maybe she would be. The hospital entrance came into view through the rain-streaked windshield, the familiar red emergency sign, the automatic doors, the world she knew better than any other, the one she'd worked inside for 4 years, where she understood every protocol and every shortcut and every face on the night shift. She was going in through those doors tonight as a patient. She hadn't imagined it like this. Damon pulled up to the entrance and Garrett was already out before the vehicle stopped, speaking to the triage nurse who had stepped outside. Someone had called ahead, probably Marcus, probably while she wasn't paying attention, and Mason helped her out of the car with the careful deliberateness of someone who was terrified of doing it wrong and was not going to let that terror show. "I've got you," he said. She stood in the rain for just one more second, looking back at the city stretching behind her, at whatever was still happening in that dining room in that house with those locked doors. She felt the baby shift again, that small rotation, that particular presence that had been with her for 8 months through every terrible night and every worse morning. "Yeah," she said. She meant it as a correction, maybe. Not "you've got me," something more like, "I've got this." She walked through the doors. The automatic doors closed behind her and the warmth of the hospital hit her like a physical thing, that specific institutional warmth, recycled air, and antiseptic, and something underneath both of those that she had always privately thought of as the smell of people trying very hard to stay alive. She had walked through these doors 400 times, maybe more. She knew which fluorescent panel in the corridor near radiology flickered between 2 and 4 in the morning. She knew that the vending machine outside the break room accepted crumpled bills if you smoothed them against your thigh first. She knew every nurse at the triage desk by name, by shift preference, by the particular way each of them held a clipboard. Tonight, the triage nurse was Sandra Okafor, who had worked Friday nights for 3 years, and who now looked at Noelle with an expression that moved through recognition, confusion, and careful professional neutrality in the span of about 2 seconds. "Noelle." "Hey, Sandra." "How far apart?" 3 minutes now, maybe less." Sandra was already moving, already reaching for the wheelchair that sat folded against the wall, already doing the specific, efficient things that good triage nurses did without needing to think about them. Noelle let herself be guided into the chair and felt something release in her chest, the particular relief of being somewhere with a protocol, somewhere that had a defined procedure for exactly this kind of crisis, somewhere that knew what to do with her. She had not known what to do with herself for months. Damon and Garrett stayed in the waiting area at Marcus's quiet instruction. Not a request. Marcus didn't make requests in moments like this. He simply arranged people into positions, and the people generally complied because there was something in his voice that understood logistics. Mason came through the double doors with her. Nobody stopped him. He was the kind of person who moved through spaces in a way that didn't invite challenge, not because he was large or intimidating, but because he walked like he was supposed to be there, wherever there happened to be. They put her in room 7. She knew room 7. She had stood on the other side of that bed more times than she could count. The nurse who came in to do the initial assessment was a woman named Patricia Holt, who was 53 years old and had been doing this since before Noelle was born, and who looked at Noelle's face for approximately 3 seconds before saying, "You want me to page Dr. Reeves, or you want someone you don't know?" "Reeves," Noelle said without hesitating. "Okay." Patricia wrote something on her chart. "Someone call your husband." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Mason, standing near the door with his arms crossed, and his jaw doing a particular thing it did when he was angry and was not going to say so, said, "We'll handle that." Patricia looked at him, looked at Noelle, wrote something else on the chart, and left without pursuing it further, because Patricia Holt had worked labor and delivery for 30 years and understood which questions not to ask. The contractions were coming faster. Between them, in the brief windows of relative clarity, Noelle stared at the ceiling tiles and tried to organize her thoughts into something manageable. She kept returning to the boxes. The boxes stacked in the underground garage, visible through the service entrance when she'd walked the perimeter. Her life assembled into cardboard with no particular care, the kind of packing job done by someone who doesn't value the contents and is simply trying to clear space. She had seen the corner of her mother's journal, brown leather cover with the fraying edge on the lower right. She knew that fraying edge the way she knew her own hands. Her mother had carried that journal for years before the accident, had written in it almost every day, had left it 40% empty, a sentence unfinished on the last page as though she'd simply stepped away and would be back to complete the thought. Noelle had carried it through every apartment since, had never written in it, had always believed she would know the right moment when it arrived. It was in a box in a garage in a house she could no longer enter. "Hey." Mason had moved closer. I was sitting in the chair beside the bed now, forearms on his knees, not quite touching her, but near enough. "Where'd you go?" "Nowhere." Another contraction. She breathed through it, long exhale, the way she'd taught, the way she knew. And when it released, she said, "How did you know where I was?" Mason was quiet for a moment. "Marcus has been watching the house." She turned her head. "For how long?" "Few weeks." Mason. "You stopped answering on a Tuesday," he said. "Not a Friday. A Tuesday. You'd never missed a Tuesday before. I called Damon that same night." She looked at him. This 26-year-old who drove 40 minutes across the city every Sunday for family dinner and called her twice a week without explanation, and had apparently, without telling her, organized his brothers into some kind of quiet surveillance operation because she'd missed a phone call. "You should have told me," she said. "You would have told us to stop." She didn't argue with that because it was accurate. Dr. Reeves arrived at 11:47. Noelle knew because she checked the clock, because she was a nurse and checking the clock was reflexive, and assessed the situation with the brisk economy of a woman who had delivered approximately 2,000 babies and found drama unproductive. She was 61, short, had gray hair cut practically, and had once told Noelle during a particularly brutal overnight shift that the secret to longevity in medicine was refusing to take anything personally. "You're at 7 centimeters, she said, snapping off her gloves. "This is happening tonight." "I know," Noelle said. "Is there anyone else who should be here?" The question was carefully phrased. Not "where is your husband?" Not "should we call the father?" Just "anyone else?" Dr. Reeves had been practicing this kind of careful phrasing for decades. "No," Noelle said. Dr. Reeves nodded once and moved on. What happened next took 4 hours, and Noelle would later remember it in fragments rather than as a continuous sequence. The particular quality of Mason's breathing when he was trying not to react to something, the cold of the monitoring equipment, the way Patricia moved around the room with the specific efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and still cared whether it went well. At some point, Damon appeared in the doorway, and Patricia told him the waiting room was through the double doors, and he said very politely that he understood, and then he stayed in the doorway anyway, and Patricia decided not to fight it. At 2:17 in the morning, a baby girl arrived in the world. She did not arrive quietly. She arrived with the particular furious announcement of someone who had opinions about the situation and intended to make them known, and the sound of it, that first real sound, moved through Noelle in a way she had no clinical language for and had never, despite 4 years of attending this exact moment for other people, anticipated correctly. She had thought she would feel relief. She had thought she would feel exhaustion, which she did, but underneath it something else entirely, something that had no name she could locate, that simply occupied her chest completely and left no room for anything else. Patricia placed the baby on her chest. Noelle put both hands around her and held on. Mason made a sound in the corner of the room that he immediately tried to suppress and failed. For approximately 90 seconds, nothing else existed. Then the door opened. She heard it before she saw it. The particular sound of a door opened with authority, the specific weight of someone who was accustomed to entering rooms and having the rooms reorganize themselves around his arrival. She didn't have to look up to know. She had spent 2 years learning the specific pressure that Damien Ashcroft brought into any space he occupied. She looked up anyway. He was standing in the doorway in the charcoal shirt she'd seen through the dining room window. He'd come directly then. Hadn't stopped to change. His eyes went to the baby first. She watched them do it, watched the precise moment of impact, something moving across his face that she couldn't immediately categorize. Mason was on his feet. "You need to leave," Mason said. His voice was absolutely level, which was the most dangerous version of Mason's voice. "That's my child," Damien said. "This is a restricted area." "I don't care what I'm going to ask you one more time," Mason said, "to leave this room." Damien looked at Noelle. She looked back at him. She was holding her daughter against her chest with both hands, and she was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical, exhausted at a cellular level, and she looked at this man she had married 3 years ago. This man she had cooked breakfast for on Sunday mornings and argued with about the thermostat and sat beside in the dark on the nights when his particular demons made sleep impossible for him. And she felt nothing that she had expected to feel. Not rage. Not grief. Not the complicated ache she'd been carrying for months. Just a very clear, very quiet understanding that they were done. "Damien," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was slightly surprised by that. He looked at her. "Not tonight," she said. Something moved across his face. She watched it happen, this brief, unguarded thing, before the control came back and he assembled his expression into something unreadable. He looked at the baby one more time. Then he turned and walked out. Mason remained standing until the sound of footsteps had faded completely down the corridor. Then he sat back down, put his hands on his knees, let out a breath slowly. "He found out fast," Damon said from the doorway. "Marcus," Mason said. "Marcus told him?" "Marcus told us he was on his way. Somebody from the house must have seen us leave." Mason looked at Noelle. "You okay?" She was looking down at her daughter. "Yeah," she said. She wasn't entirely, but the baby was warm against her chest and breathing in that particular new way. That rapid, shallow breath, the specific rhythm of a body that has just discovered it exists. And the not okay felt manageable in a way it hadn't in months. Like something she could carry rather than something carrying her. Garrett appeared beside Damon in the doorway. He looked at the baby. His face did something complicated and quiet. He cleared his throat. "She's got Mom's forehead," he said. Nobody disagreed. The next several hours moved in the slow, non-linear way of hospital time, vitals, documentation, the particular bureaucratic requirements that followed a birth, even when everything had gone without complication. Noelle filled out forms with the careful attention she gave everything clinical, making decisions about each field with a deliberateness that felt like the first real agency she'd exercised in months. There was a line for the father's name. She left it blank. The admitting clerk, a young woman with reading glasses, pushed up on her forehead, glanced at it, and then at Noelle, and then wrote something in a note field and moved to the next item without comment. At some point, Marcus appeared. He had clearly been managing something outside. He had the specific, slightly disheveled quality of someone who had been navigating logistics while everyone else was occupied with the human part of the situation. "He left," Marcus said to Damon. "Alone?" "2 cars with him, his security team." Marcus paused. "He didn't go back to the house. That was information. She registered it the way she registered most information right now, from a slight distance, through the filter of exhaustion and the weight of her daughter in her arms. "Where did he go?" Mason asked. "His downtown office, the one in the Ashcroft building." Marcus glanced at Noelle. "I don't think he knew you were in labor. I think someone called him and he just came." She considered that, considered what it meant that he had come, what it meant that he had stood in that doorway and looked at the baby with that particular expression she hadn't been able to categorize. She had been a nurse long enough to know that the body responded to some things before the mind could organize a policy about them. She did not intend to let that be relevant. "Marcus," she said. "Yeah." "The box is in the garage. At the house." A pause. "What about them?" "My mother's journal is in one of them." Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'll get it." "The access codes?" "I know the codes," he said quietly. She looked at him. Her 31-year-old brother, who had been running quiet surveillance on her life for weeks, and had apparently, at some point, obtained the access codes to her husband's property, and who said this as though it were a simple logistical detail rather than the kind of thing that could end a career. "Marcus," she said. "Don't," he said. "I'm serious." "So am I." He met her eyes. "I'll get the journal, tomorrow morning, early, before anyone's moving." He glanced at Damon. "Garrett'll come with me." Garrett from the corner raised a hand briefly. She opened her mouth and closed it. The baby shifted against her chest, made a small complaint, settled again. "Okay," she said. The night moved on. At some point, Mason fell asleep in the chair beside her bed, which she didn't notice until she heard the specific quality of his breathing change. She lay in the dim room listening to the hospital sounds she knew so well, the monitor rhythms, the soft movement of staff in the corridor, the particular quiet of a night ward at 4 a.m, and she held her daughter and thought about the locked doors and the candlelight and the moment Damien's hand had touched Vivian's across the table. She thought about the legal documents Marcus had mentioned 3 weeks ago when he'd first called her from outside the house and said, carefully, that she should probably know something. She hadn't wanted to know then. She'd asked him not to tell her, and he'd complied, and she'd spent 3 weeks trying to convince herself that whatever it was could be managed, addressed, discussed between two adults in a marriage that had problems, but was fundamentally still a marriage. She'd been wrong about that. The documents Marcus had mentioned were, he'd since explained, property access agreements, legal instruments giving Vivian Laurent formal authority over the residence, executed 4 months ago. Before Noelle had confronted anything, before the nightclub scene, before she'd walked up to Vivian's table and said, "I'm his wife, you're sitting in my seat." 4 months before any of that, while Noelle was still making breakfast on Sunday mornings and arguing about the thermostat, Damien had been having documents drawn up. He hadn't been withdrawing from their marriage. He had been ending it, methodically, legally, with the same precise management he applied to everything in his professional life. She had simply been the last to receive the information. Her daughter made another small sound. Noelle looked down at her. This face, this entirely new face that belonged to no one, and already looked, as Garrett had said, slightly like their mother around the forehead and eyes. She thought about the journal in the box in the garage, the unfinished sentence on the last page, the 40% of empty pages that had been waiting for 13 years. She knew what she wanted to write in them. She wasn't ready yet. At 6:45 in the morning, while Mason was still asleep and the corridor outside had begun to take on the particular quality of an early shift transition, her phone lit up on the bedside table. She looked at the screen. Damien. She looked at it for 3 full rings, then she set it face down. 30 seconds later, a text. "We need to talk." She looked at that for a while, too. Then she put the phone in the drawer of the bedside table and closed it. Marcus and Garrett left before 7 to make the drive across the city. Mason woke at 7:15 and immediately looked at the baby, then at Noelle, with the disoriented checking quality of someone who had fallen asleep on guard duty and was doing a rapid inventory. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," she said. He texted. Mason's jaw did the thing again. "What did you do?" "Nothing." He nodded slowly. "Okay." "Mason." She looked at him. "I need you to tell me what you all have, what you've actually found." A pause. He sat up straighter in the chair. "This isn't the time. It's exactly the time," she said quietly. "I'm lying in a hospital bed and I'm thinking clearly for the first time in months, and I want to know what we're dealing with." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Damon should be here for this." "Then call him." Damon arrived in 11 minutes, which meant he'd been in the parking structure. He came in with 2 coffees from the vending machine, she recognized the cups, and handed one to Mason without comment and stood at the foot of the bed and looked at her with the particular stillness their father had carried. "You want the full version," he said. "Yes." He and Mason exchanged a look. Then Damon set his coffee down on the window ledge and told her. It took 20 minutes. He spoke quietly, methodically, in the same way he did everything. No editorializing, no emotional commentary, just the sequence of what they had found and how. Shell companies registered in 3 states, a financial network that moved money between legitimate real estate holdings and sources. Marcus's contacts at the precinct were fairly certain weren't legitimate. Property transactions that didn't track against any visible income source. An attorney of record who appeared on filings going back 4 years, predating Noel's marriage by 2 years, who had a professional relationship with Damien that was, according to every document Marcus had been able to locate, not strictly limited to legal counsel. "Vivienne Laurent," Noel said. "She's embedded in it," Damon said. "Not just as his lawyer. Her name's on 3 of the companies." Noel was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Chicago was doing its morning thing. The specific gray brightness of a November dawn. The sound of traffic building on the street below. "So she's not just—" Noel stopped. Reorganized. "She's not just a personal involvement." "No," Mason said. "She's a business partner." "Has been for at least 4 years," Damon said. She thought about that. Thought about the timeline. Met Damien 3 years ago. Married him 2.5 years ago. Which meant that when Damien had walked into Mercy General's emergency room with a gunshot wound disguised as an industrial accident, Vivienne Laurent had already been in his professional life for over a year. Which meant that the entire courtship, the quiet breakfasts, the early morning walks, the accidental ring in the coat pocket, had occurred while this woman was already woven into his financial structure. She had never been a beginning, she had been a detour. "There's something else," Mason said. She looked at him. He glanced at Damon. Damon picked up his coffee from the window ledge and looked out at the city. "The house," Mason said. "The deed." "What about it?" "It transferred. Last month." The room was very quiet for a moment. The monitor beside the bed beeped its soft, regular beat. "To Vivienne," Noel said. "Yes." She processed that. The marble floors she had spent 3 weekends choosing. The lamp she had found at the estate sale and rewired herself. Her mother's painting near the stairs. "While I was living there," she said. "Yes." She looked down at her daughter. The baby was asleep now. The absolute boneless sleep of a newborn, fully committed, no reservations. She watched her breathe for a moment. "I need a lawyer," Noel said. "Garrett's already made a call," Mason said. "A good one." "Garrett only makes one kind of call." She almost smiled. Almost. Her phone buzzed again in the closed drawer. She didn't open it. Outside, the city brightened by degrees in the winter morning, and her daughter slept, and the 4 brothers moved quietly around the hospital room like people who had decided something without needing to say it aloud. The particular coordination of a family that had been practicing this, in smaller ways, for years. At 8:52 in the morning, Marcus called Damon from outside. Damon listened, said 3 words. Hung up. He looked at Noel. "Damien's attorney contacted Marcus," he said. "Not his personal attorney. A different firm." He paused. "They're filing for custodial rights." The room went still. "He hasn't even seen her," Mason said, and the level quality in his voice had shifted slightly, had developed an edge beneath it that hadn't been there before. "Preemptive," Damon said. "Filing before any other proceedings." Noel looked at the baby. She thought about what it meant. The specific legal machinery of it, the calculated preemption, the fact that he had gone directly from the hospital corridor to his downtown office and had, within hours, instructed an attorney to file. Not out of love. Not out of the expression she'd watched move across his face in the doorway. Out of the same methodical management that had transferred the house deed while she was sleeping in it, that had installed Vivienne Laurent in her life incrementally until the installation was complete. She was not a wife he was divorcing. She was an asset he was liquidating. And her daughter, their daughter, was apparently the last item on the inventory. She looked at Mason, then at Damon, then at her phone in the closed drawer. "Get Garrett's lawyer on the phone," she said. Her voice was steady. Steadier than she felt. Steady steadier than she had any right to be on 4 hours of broken sleep in a hospital bed 12 hours after giving birth, but steady nonetheless. "Now," she said. Mason was already dialing before the word was fully out. Garrett's lawyer was a woman named Claire Sung, and she answered the phone on the second ring at 9 in the morning on a Saturday, which told Noelle something about either her professional dedication or the nature of her relationship with Garrett, and Noelle decided not to pursue either line of inquiry. "Tell me what they filed," Claire said. "Not hello. Not how are you. Just tell me what they filed." Mason read from the message Marcus had forwarded. Claire was quiet while he read. The specific quality of her silence was professional, the silence of someone absorbing information and organizing it simultaneously. "Preemptive custodial claim," she said when he finished. "Yes." "Before any divorce proceedings?" "Yes." Another brief silence. "Who's the filing attorney?" "Harmon Doyle Associates." A pause that was different from the previous ones, shorter with a different texture. "Harmon Doyle," she said. "You know them," Mason said. "I know them," Claire said. "Give me 2 hours." She hung up. Noelle looked at the phone in Mason's hand. "That pause," she said, when he said the firm's name. "Yeah," Mason said. "What does that mean?" "It means we wait 2 hours," he said. And he didn't say it dismissively. He said it the way people say things when they don't have an answer yet, and pretending otherwise would be an insult. She looked at her daughter. The baby was awake now, doing the unfocused early searching that newborns did, the specific quality of attention that wasn't yet attention but was becoming it. Noelle put her finger against the baby's palm and felt the instinctive grip close around it, that reflex grip, that absolutely automatic reaching, and she held still. 2 hours, she thought. She could do 2 hours. What she could not do, as it turned out, was 2 hours of waiting in a hospital room with 3 of her brothers rotating in and out and nothing to do but think. At 10 minutes past 9, Elena Morales called. She almost didn't answer. The number had no contact name attached to it. Elena had called from a different phone, a number Noelle didn't have saved. She recognized the Chicago area code and the particular way her instincts moved when something felt important, and she answered. "It's Elena." The voice was low, slightly strained, the specific compression of someone speaking quietly in a space where they didn't want to be overheard. "Elena." Noelle sat up straighter. "Where are you?" "I'm outside. I'm near the hospital. I saw the cars last night. I knew where you'd gone." A brief pause. "I was fired this morning." Noelle closed her eyes for a moment. "I know. I heard. Vivian came at 7. Elena's voice did something complicated. She already had keys. New keys. She walked through the house like she was doing an inventory. Noelle was aware of Mason watching her from the chair. She kept her voice level. "Elena, you don't have to—" "I need to tell you something," Elena said. "I should have told you weeks ago. I didn't, and I need to tell you now." "Okay." "The box is in the garage." A pause. "I packed them." Noelle said nothing. "She told me to. Vivian, 3 days ago. She gave me a list of items and told me to have everything in boxes by Friday." Elena's voice had gone flat. In the way voices went flat when someone was delivering information they felt terrible about. "I tried to be careful with the journal. I wrapped it in one of your sweaters. The blue one. I put it at the top." "Elena." "I'm sorry. I should have called you. I should have called you 3 days ago when she gave me the list, but I was scared and I'm sorry." Noelle let out a breath. "It's okay." "It's not. You were in an impossible position. You were in a worse one, and you didn't make it impossible for anyone else." Elena's voice cracked slightly on that sentence. "The journal is still there, in the garage. Marcus was here this morning. He got in through the service entrance, and I saw him on the camera before Vivian took my access. He had the journal. He got it." "I know," Noelle said. "He told me." A brief exhale of relief on the other end. Then Elena said, "There's something else." Noelle waited. "The night you came, when you were standing at the kitchen door." Elena paused. "I wanted to open it. I stood there with my hand on the handle, and I wanted to open it." "I know you did." "Vivian was in the kitchen. She'd come down for water and she was standing behind me and she said—" Elena stopped. "She said if I opened that door, she would make sure I never worked in this city again. She has connections. I knew she had connections. I believed her. Noelle sat with that for a moment. The rain, the frosted glass panel, the footsteps she'd heard approaching and then stopping, the particular silence that had followed. She thought about Vivienne Laurent standing in her kitchen at midnight, watching Noelle's silhouette through the glass and making that calculation. I believe you, Noelle said. I should have opened the door. Maybe, Noelle said, but she would have done exactly what she said. I know. A pause. She's going to do it anyway. I'm already fired. Elena's voice steadied. I want to help you, whatever you need. I was in that house for 6 years and I saw things, and I'm willing to say what I saw. Noelle looked at Mason. He was watching her with complete attention. Can you come in? Noelle said. To the hospital. Yes. Ask for room 7 in labor and delivery. Tell them your family. A brief pause. Okay. And Elena, thank you for calling. She hung up. Mason said, Who's that? The housekeeper, former housekeeper. Noelle shifted the baby slightly in her arms. She wants to help. She saw things. What kind of things? I don't know yet. She looked at him. But she was scared of Vivienne enough to not open a door for me in the middle of the night. Whatever she knows, it was worth being scared about. Mason nodded slowly. He texted something, presumably to the group chain that she was fairly certain existed and had definitely been active all night. Elena arrived at 9:42, a small woman in her late 40s with dark hair and the specific exhausted composure of someone who had been holding themselves together through effort rather than ease. She came into room 7 and looked at Noelle and the baby, and her composure moved briefly before she pulled it back. She's beautiful, Elena said. Sit down, Noelle said. Tell me what you saw. Elena sat. She folded her hands in her lap, looked at them for a moment, and then looked at Noelle and began. It took 40 minutes. Some of it Noelle had suspected. The overnight visitors, men she didn't recognize, arriving after midnight through the underground garage entrance, meeting with Damien in the study for an hour or two before leaving the same way they came. Elena described them with the careful precision of someone who had been paying attention. The way they dressed, what they carried, the fact that no record of their visits appeared in the security log because the relevant footage was systematically deleted the following morning by someone with system access. Some of it Noelle had not suspected. The phone calls Vivienne made from the house, from a landline in the kitchen, which seemed deliberately chosen, which suggested she understood the landline wouldn't be captured on the same logging system as the mobile network. The specific days, always a Thursday, always after 11 at night, always for between 8 and 20 minutes. Elena had never heard the content. She had heard the tone, clipped, businesslike, a voice that was not using the phone to communicate warmth, but to communicate instructions. And then the last thing, the thing that Elena had been building toward for 40 minutes, that she had clearly been deciding whether to say for longer than that. There was a man, Elena said. He came 4 times in the last 2 months, not through the garage, through the front, openly, like a guest. Damien introduced him to me once as a consultant. She paused. His name was Reeves. Noelle went very still. Not Dr. Reeves, Elena said quickly. A different Reeves, younger, maybe 40. He had a legal pad and he asked to use the study, and Damien let him use it for 2 hours and then he left. A consultant, Noelle said. That's what Damien said. What kind of consultant? Elena looked at her hands again. The last time he came, 3 weeks ago, I heard part of what they were discussing. I wasn't trying to. I was in the hallway and the door wasn't fully closed. She paused. They were talking about the baby. The room was very quiet. What about the baby? Noelle said. About custody, Elena said. About how to establish it. The man, Reeves, he was explaining something about how to file first, before any other party had established legal standing. She stopped. He said the word preemptive. I remember specifically because I didn't know it and I looked it up after. Noelle stared at her. 3 weeks ago. The baby was still 4 weeks from being born. 3 weeks ago, Damien had been sitting in his study with a consultant who specialized in custody strategy, discussing how to file first, how to establish legal standing before any other party could. While Noelle was still living in his house, while she was still sleeping in his bed, while she was still trying to understand what was happening to her marriage. He planned it, she said. The words came out very flat, not a question. I think so, Elena said. Yes. She looked at the baby. The custody filing this morning. The one that had felt like a preemptive strike, a legal aggression launched from a position of anger, wasn't anger at all. It was the final execution of a plan that had been in development for months. While Damien had been withdrawing from her, while Vivian had been incrementally occupying her spaces, while the house deed had been transferred and the access codes had been changed and her life had been systematically dismantled, he had also been building a legal framework designed to take her child. She had thought he was ending their marriage. He had been ending her. The baby made a sound. Noelle realized her arms had tightened involuntarily, and she loosened them, deliberately, and breathed. "Elena," she said, "are you willing to put that in writing?" "Yes," Elena said without hesitating. "It could make things difficult for you." "She already fired me." Elena met her eyes. "There's nothing left to threaten." At 10:47, Claire Sung called back. "Harmon Doyle Associates," she said, when Mason answered and put the call on speaker. "They're Damien Ashcroft's primary legal firm for 3 of his LLCs, not his personal attorney, his business attorney, the firm that handles the shell companies." Mason looked at Noelle. "So the custody filing," he started, "came from his business legal team," Claire said. "Not a family lawyer, not someone who specializes in custody, someone who specializes in protecting financial assets and corporate structures." A pause. "He's not filing for his child. He's filing to create leverage." Noelle heard herself say, "Explain that." "If he has a custody claim, even a weak one, even one that would never succeed at trial, he has a legal connection to you, to your family, to your brothers." Claire's voice was precise and careful. "Marcus Carter is a detective. Damon Carter has a clean record. Garrett Carter. Garrett gave me a full picture of his background. Your brothers have been building a case against your husband's financial network." Silence. "He knows," Noelle said. "He's known for a while, I think," Claire said. "The custody filing isn't about the child. It's about creating a legal entanglement that gives him standing to subpoena your family's communications, their financial records, any documentation they've assembled." Another pause. "If he can establish himself as a party in a family court proceeding, it opens doors that would otherwise require a federal warrant." Mason said very quietly, "He's using the baby to get to us." "That's my read," Claire said. Noelle looked at Elena, who had gone pale, looked at Mason, who was doing the still thing that was not peace, looked at her daughter. She thought about the consultant named Reeves, the legal pad, the word preemptive. 3 weeks ago, while she was still making Sunday breakfast, she thought about the expression on Damien's face in the doorway of room 7, the unguarded thing she hadn't been able to categorize. She understood it now. Not love, not regret, recognition. He had looked at the baby and understood that the timeline had arrived. "Claire," she said, "what do we do?" "First, you don't respond to the filing directly. Any response from your family, especially Marcus, validates the jurisdiction." Claire's voice was steady and fast, someone who thought in solutions. "Second, you need to move faster than he is. I can file a protective order this morning. Given the circumstances of last night, the locked residence, a pregnant woman in labor, the documented abandonment, I have enough for an emergency filing." "Do it," Noelle said. "Third," Claire paused, "everything your brothers have assembled, the financial documentation, the corporate records, the network map, where is it?" Mason said, "Secure." "How secure?" "Secure enough." "Not good enough," Claire said flatly. "If he has any reason to believe the documentation exists and knows your brothers built it, he will move to suppress it before it can be used in any proceeding. It needs to be in the hands of someone he can't reach, not a personal attorney, federal." A silence. "You're talking about Marcus making a call," Damon said from the doorway. He had come in sometime during the last 10 minutes, and Noelle hadn't tracked exactly when. "I'm talking about Marcus making a call," Claire confirmed. "Today. Before Harmon Doyle figures out how far along the documentation actually is." Marcus, Noelle knew, was not in the room. He was somewhere outside managing things she couldn't see, the way he had been since the beginning. She thought about what it would cost him, the call Claire was describing, the formal handoff of evidence he'd built outside his official capacity to federal hands, the career implications, the specific position it put him in. She thought about him standing outside the house in the dark 3 weeks ago, running quiet surveillance because she'd missed a phone call on a Tuesday. "Someone call Marcus," she said. Damon was already on his phone. What happened in the next 4 hours moved with the specific compressed urgency of events that have been building for a long time and are now releasing all at once. Claire filed the protective order at 11:15. Noelle signed documents on her phone that Mason held at the right angle because she still had the baby in her other arm and was not putting her down. Marcus made his call at 11:40, and she didn't ask who he called or what it cost him, because those were things she would deal with later, in the specific order that things needed to be dealt with. At 12:30, Vivienne Laurent arrived at Mercy General. She did not come to room 7. She came to the maternity ward nurses station, and she asked, in the voice of someone accustomed to receiving information simply by asking for it, for the room number of Noelle Ashcroft. The nurse at the desk, a woman named Donna, who had worked with Noelle for 3 years and who had heard, through the specific information network that existed among hospital night staff, some version of what had happened, looked at Vivienne Laurent and said, "I'm sorry, I can't share patient information." "I'm her attorney," Vivienne said. "Then you'll need to contact the hospital's legal department," Donna said, "Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. Vivienne looked at her for a moment, the specific look of someone who expected resistance to dissolve and was recalibrating. "Tell her Vivienne Laurent is here," she said. "I can't leave my station," Donna said pleasantly. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Noelle heard about this afterward from Donna, who stopped by room 7 at the end of her shift specifically to deliver the account with the barely suppressed satisfaction of someone who had thoroughly enjoyed the exchange. What she did not hear about secondhand, what she experienced directly, was the phone call at 1:15. It was Damien. She answered it. She wasn't certain why. Maybe because she was tired of not knowing what was coming. Maybe document everything going forward, and a phone call was documentation. Maybe because she wanted to hear his voice in the clear light of what she now understood and confirm the understanding. "Noelle." His voice was even. The evenness itself was information. "Damien, we should talk about this outside of legal channels." "That ship," she said, "has sailed." A pause. "I'm not trying to take her from you. You filed a custody claim at 9 in the morning. A precautionary measure. You hired a custody consultant 3 weeks before she was born, while I was still living in your house." Silence. A different kind of silence from the professional pauses. "Elena," he said. Not a question, just the name, flat, like something being closed. "Yes," Noelle said. She heard him breathe, slow, controlled, the specific breath of someone managing their response. "Whatever she told you." "I'm going to stop you there," Noelle said, and her voice was steady in a way she was going to think about later. This specific steadiness that had arrived somewhere in the last 12 hours and seemed to have settled into her bones. "I don't want to talk about what Elena told me or what it means. I don't want to discuss custody strategy or legal channels or precautionary measures." She paused. "I want to ask you one question." He was quiet. "When you came to the hospital last night," she said, "when you stood in that doorway, was any part of that, any part, not strategic?" A very long pause, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "She looks like you." Noelle closed her eyes. "That's not an answer," she said. "It's the only one I have," he said. She held the phone for another second. Then she said, "Have your attorneys contact Claire Sung. Don't call this number again." And she hung up. She sat in the quiet room with her daughter, and her hands were not entirely steady, and she let them be unsteady because there was no one she needed to be steady for at this particular moment. The baby was asleep again. Outside the window, Chicago was doing the thing it did in November at midday, gray and bright simultaneously, that particular flat winter light that made everything look both clear and cold. She had asked him one question, and he had answered a different one, and the answer to the different one had hit her. Somewhere she hadn't expected, which made her angry at herself, which she also let happen because anger at herself was at least an honest feeling. "She looks like you." She had wanted him to say something terrible. She had wanted confirmation of the version of him that made everything clean and simple. Instead, he had said the one true thing, the unguarded thing, and it had done what unguarded true things always did, complicated everything. She was still thinking about it when Marcus came in at 2 o'clock. He looked like he hadn't slept. He had the particular quality of someone who had been making difficult calls in parking structures for the past several hours and was now done with that part and needed to tell her what it had cost. "It's done," he said. "What did you have to do?" she said. He sat down. He looked at his hands. He said, I had to disclose how I obtained some of the records. Marcus. It's handled. It's not. It won't end my career. He said this carefully, in the way people said things that were true but contained additional detail they weren't sharing, but I had to give them everything, the full documentation, all of it. And? He looked up. And they're interested, he said. Very interested. The financial network is bigger than we knew. Harmon Doyle shows up in 3 other investigations already open. The custody filing this morning actually... He paused. It flagged something, the timing of it. They want to know why Damian Ashcroft would make a move that exposed his legal firm this morning specifically. What does that mean? Mason said from the corner. It means something is already moving on their end, Marcus said. Something we didn't know about. Something that made him feel like he needed leverage. Fast. He looked at Noelle. He's not just trying to get to us. He's scared of something that was already coming. She absorbed that. Damian Ashcroft, who had managed a criminal network with the precision of a financial architect, who had dismantled her marriage with the methodical patience of someone executing a long-planned strategy, who had looked at his daughter through a hospital doorway and said, "She looks like you." He was afraid of something that had nothing to do with her, and he had tried to use her daughter as a shield. Something moved through her chest that was not grief and was not rage and was not the complicated ache she'd been carrying for months. It was something colder and cleaner, something that felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, like clarity. "Marcus?" she said. "Yeah." "Does Claire know about this? The federal interest?" "I called her from the parking structure." "What did she say?" He looked at her steadily. "She said you're no longer just the injured party in a divorce." He paused. "She said you're a witness." The word landed in the room and stayed there. Noelle looked at her daughter. 8 hours old. 8 hours in the world and already at the center of something that had been built long before she existed. Something that Noelle herself had walked into without understanding what it was. Something that had been patient and deliberate and had never, not for a single moment, included her in its plans. A witness. She thought about what that meant, what it would require, what it would expose, what it would cost her brothers, each of them, and in what specific ways. She thought about Claire Sung answering the phone on the second ring on a Saturday morning and saying, "Tell me what they filed." She thought about Elena in the kitchen doorway at midnight, hand on the handle, Vivian Laurent standing behind her. She thought about a legal pad and a man named Reeves, and the word preemptive looked up in a dictionary by a housekeeper who had packed her belongings into boxes with care, who had wrapped her mother's journal in a blue sweater so it wouldn't get damaged. She thought about all the things that had been done to her while she was looking in the wrong direction, and she understood that she was no longer the person who looked away. "Tell Claire," she said, "that I'll talk to whoever she needs me to talk to." She met Marcus's eyes. "All of it. Everything I know. Everything I saw." She paused. "Everything I didn't understand at the time but understand now." Mason said, "Noelle?" "I know what I'm doing," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded. Outside, Chicago moved through its afternoon without knowing that anything had shifted in a hospital room on the 4th floor of Mercy General, that a woman who had been systematically erased had just decided to become something that couldn't be erased, something that left a record, something that would require a different and more significant effort to silence than changed locks and transferred deeds and a custody filing at 9 in the morning on a Saturday. She looked at her daughter. "Your name," she said quietly, to no one in particular, and to the only person that mattered, "is going to mean something." The baby slept on, indifferent to the weight of the statement, which was probably exactly right. The weight belonged to Noelle, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, prepared to carry it. 3 days after giving birth, Noelle walked out of Mercy General on her own feet. She had declined the wheelchair twice. Patricia Holt had given her the specific look of a woman who had seen this particular stubbornness before, and understood it was not stubbornness at all, but necessity. The specific need of someone who had been horizontal and dependent and managed for long enough that standing upright under her own power was not a preference but a requirement. Patricia had noted the refusal in the chart and handed her discharge papers and said, quietly, at the door, "You come back if anything feels wrong. Anything at all." "I know the signs," Noelle said. "I know you do," Patricia said. "Come back anyway." Damon brought the car to the entrance. Not the house. She wasn't going to the house, would never go back to that house, but to the small apartment Elena had mentioned, the one far from Damian's network, which Elena had arranged through a cousin and which had been quietly stalked over the previous 2 days by her brothers in the specific way her brothers did things. Without announcement, without asking what she needed, simply determining what was necessary and providing it. She got into the car with her daughter in the car seat Mason had installed the previous afternoon, buckled in with the careful over-precision of a man who had watched 3 instructional videos and was taking no chances. She looked at the city moving past the window. Her daughter slept. Claire Sung called at 10:40. Harmon Doyle withdrew the custody filing, she said. Noelle looked at the back of Damon's head. When? This morning, 8:15. A pause. It's not a concession, it's a retreat. They pulled it because pursuing it was going to require discovery, and discovery was going to expose the connection between the firm and Ashcroft's financial network. Someone made a calculation. Damien, or his people, someone understood the filing was becoming a liability faster than it was becoming an asset. Claire's voice was precise. This is good news. It's also a warning. He's recalibrating. What does that mean for us? It means he's going to come at this differently. A brief pause. The federal contact Marcus made, they want to meet with you directly, not through representation. They want to sit across from you and hear what you know in your own words. When? They said as soon as possible. Their words. Noelle looked at her daughter's face in the mirror installed on the back seat headrest, one of those small convex baby mirrors, also installed by Mason, that let you watch the baby while driving. Her daughter's face in sleep had the absolute serenity of someone who had no historical context for any of this, which was, at this moment, the most beautiful thing Noelle had ever seen. Tell them tomorrow, she said. Morning. You gave birth 3 days ago. Tell them morning, she said again. Claire was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. I'll be there with you. I know, Noelle said. That evening, in the small apartment that smelled of new cleaning products, and the faint residual scent of whatever Elena's cousin cooked on weekdays, Noelle sat at the kitchen table with her mother's journal open in front of her. Marcus had retrieved it that first morning, wrapped still in the blue sweater, undamaged. She had not opened it since it had come back into her possession. She had held it several times, had set it on the bedside table at the hospital and looked at it, had carried it home today in her bag without taking it out. Now she opened it. Her mother's handwriting, slightly right-leaning, the specific inconsistency of someone who had learned to write in a language that wasn't their first and had carried that small asymmetry into English, filled the pages in that particular density she remembered. Not cramped, but full. Her mother had not wasted space. She read until Mason knocked on the apartment door at 7 with takeout containers from the Thai place near the hospital that she had eaten at approximately twice a week for 4 years and had mentioned once, offhandedly, 6 months ago. He remembered. Of course he did. They ate at the kitchen table with the baby and the portable bassinet Garrett had assembled that afternoon, the two of them not talking much, which was fine. Mason had never required conversation to be present, had always understood that presence itself was the offering, and Noelle had always been grateful for that. At some point he said, "How are you actually doing?" "I don't know yet," she said. He nodded, ate a piece of tofu, said, "That's an honest answer. I'm trying to be honest about things." "I noticed," he said. At 9 he left. She fed the baby. She did the specific practical things that new motherhood required, the things she knew clinically and was now learning personally, which were the same actions but felt completely different from the inside. At 11 she slept for 2 hours. At 1 she was up again. At 3 she sat in the kitchen dark with her daughter against her chest and thought about tomorrow. The meeting was in a federal building downtown. She had been inside it twice before, professionally. Once accompanying a patient who needed to give a statement, once for a certification renewal that had been misdirected there by a clerical error. She knew where the parking was. She knew the security checkpoint on the ground floor required removing shoes. She knew these things, and knowing them was not the same as being ready, but it was something. She thought about Damien. She thought about the things she hadn't been able to stop thinking about for 3 days, which was the specific word. Preemptive looked up in a dictionary by Elena Morales after a meeting in his study 3 weeks before his daughter was born. She thought about the expression on his face in the hospital doorway. She thought about the phone call. "She looks like you." And the way he had said it, the unguarded quality of it, which she had been trying to categorize as strategy and kept failing to. She thought about what she was going to say tomorrow, and she thought about what she was going to have to be to say it. The federal building had a specific smell, old carpet and recirculated air, and the faint institutional permanence of a place that had been processing serious matters for decades and had developed a particular gravity as a result. Claire met her in the lobby at 9, wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather portfolio, and looking like someone who had slept 8 hours and eaten a real breakfast, which Noelle suspected was true and which she did not resent. "You ready?" Claire said. "No," Noelle said. "Good," Claire said. "Honest people who aren't ready are more credible than people who are." They went through security. They took an elevator to the 6th floor. A woman with a federal ID badge met them in the corridor and walked them to a conference room with a table that had seen better decades and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. 2 men were already in the room. One was perhaps 55, gray at the temples, with the specific quality of someone who listened for a living. The other was younger, mid-30s, a legal pad, a pen he clicked twice and then set down. The older one stood. "Ms. Carter," he said it without the Ashcroft. She noticed. "I'm Special Agent Brennan. This is Agent Kowalski. Thank you for coming." "Yes," she said. She sat. Claire sat beside her. They talked for 3 hours. She had thought it would feel like an interrogation. It didn't. It felt like being very carefully listened to by people who were building something large and needed one specific piece and were trying to determine whether her piece was the right shape. Brennan asked questions in a particular sequence that she recognized, after about 40 minutes, as deliberately ordered. He was moving her through a timeline, establishing context before specifics, the way a good clinician took a patient history. She answered everything. She answered the things she knew directly and identified them as direct knowledge. She answered the things she'd inferred and identified them as inference. When she didn't know something, she said so. She described the phone calls Damien had taken in the next room at 2 in the morning during the first year of their marriage, when she had assumed they were business. She described the bruises on his hands that he explained as the gym, which she had believed because she had wanted to believe it. She described the passports she'd found in the back of the closet, 3 of them, different names, different photographs, all of him, which she had confronted him about once, and which he had explained as security measures, and which she had accepted because she had been, she understood now, choosing to accept explanations over information. She described Vivian Laurent. She described the timeline as she understood it, and Brennan cross-referenced it twice against documents he had in front of him, and both times he made a small mark on his paper. She described the night of the locked doors. Kowalski looked up from his pad when she got to that part. She described it completely. The rain, the failed codes, Elena's footsteps stopping behind the kitchen door, the candlelight through the dining room window, the way Damien's hand had touched Vivian's across the table. She described sitting on the front steps and the contraction starting and her brothers arriving in 4 black cars from 4 directions. When she finished that part, the room was quiet for a moment. Brennan said, "Ms. Carter, the passports you mentioned, can you describe them in more detail?" She described them. He made another mark. They broke at noon. Claire walked her to the elevator and said quietly, "You're doing well." "I feel like I'm taking everything apart," Noelle said. "You are," Claire said. "That's the job right now." They went back in. At 1:45, Brennan put his pen down and said, "We're going to need you to be available over the next several weeks, potentially longer. There may be additional sessions." He paused. "I want to be direct with you. What you've described today, combined with what we already have, is significant. Damien Ashcroft's network is part of a larger investigation that has been active for 14 months. You filled in gaps that we could not otherwise account for." Noelle looked at him. "What does that mean for the custody situation?" "The custody filing was withdrawn. Any future filing will be significantly complicated by the proceedings we're now initiating." He said it carefully. "I can't make you promises about legal outcomes. What I can tell you is that your cooperation has material value and that this office takes the safety of cooperating witnesses seriously." Witnesses. The word again. Landing the same way it had the first time, with the same specific weight. "My brothers," she said. "What happens to Marcus?" Brennan looked at her steadily. "Your brother came to us voluntarily with documentation he'd assembled through a combination of public records and," he paused, "methods that were technically outside his official capacity." Another pause. "He disclosed everything, fully. The documentation he provided is accurate, substantial, and is being treated as voluntarily submitted evidence. His cooperation has been noted." He held her gaze. "I can't make promises. But voluntary full disclosure carries significant weight. She let out a breath. It was not a guarantee, it was not clean, but it was something a person could work with. That evening, she called her brothers together at the apartment. All four of them, the first time since the hospital, sitting in the small living room with the baby asleep in the bassinet in the corner and takeout containers on the coffee table. She told them everything Brennan had said. She watched their faces as she talked. Damon still, absorbing. Garrett with that particular practical attention of someone building a picture. Mason watching her instead of processing the information, checking her the way he always checked her, looking for the thing underneath the thing. When she finished, Marcus said, "The disclosure." He said voluntary full disclosure carries significant weight. Marcus looked at the ceiling. He had the specific look of a man who had made a decision that had cost him something real and was now receiving the first piece of information about whether it had been the right one. He nodded once, slowly. "Okay," he said. "Marcus?" "Okay," he said again, and this time it closed the subject. Damon said, "What's next?" "I need to talk to Damien," Noel said. The room shifted. "No," Mason said immediately. "Not to negotiate, not to—" She stopped. "I need to do it in person. In public. Clara will know about it. Brennan will know about it. Everything documented." She looked at each of them. "There are things that need to be said directly. There are decisions I need to make, and I can't make them through lawyers." "What decisions?" Garrett said. She looked at the baby. "About what I'm asking for," she said. "And what I'm not asking for." A silence. "He hurt you," Mason said. It came out simpler than anything else that had been said in this room, simpler and more direct. And for that reason it hit harder than any of the legal terminology or strategic assessments. "I know," she said. "He tried to use her," Mason gestured toward the bassinet, "to get to us." "I know that too." "And you still want to sit across a table from him." She looked at her youngest brother, this 26-year-old who had called her twice a week for 13 years, who had organized his brothers into a quiet army because she'd missed a Tuesday phone call, who had held her hand in a hospital elevator and cried at the sound of his niece's first breath, and then pretended very badly that he hadn't. "I want to finish it," she said, "properly." He looked at her for a long time, then, "I'll drive you." She called Damien from the apartment that night, 8:47. He answered on the first ring, which told her he'd been expecting it, or dreading it, which in his case might look the same. "Noel." "I want to meet," she said. "In person, public place, just us." A pause. "When?" "2 days. I'll tell you where the morning of." Another pause. "All right." "Damien." She held the phone. "Come alone." "You too," he said. She thought about Mason waiting in the parking structure. "Fine," she said. She chose this coffee shop on Halstead, a neighborhood place, the kind with mismatched chairs and locally sourced everything, and a regular clientele of people who had been coming there long enough to have a usual order. No private rooms. No possibility of a controlled environment. No space for the specific performance Damien could deliver in rooms that belonged to him. She arrived 12 minutes early. She ordered a decaf and chose the table in the center, not against a wall, not near an exit. In the middle of the room, in plain sight, where anyone could see and nothing was hidden. She sat with her hands flat on the table and waited. He came in at 9 exactly. He looked like himself and he didn't. I was wearing the kind of clothing that was expensive without advertising it, and his face was arranged in the specific neutral of someone who had prepared for this. But underneath the preparation, something was different. He was tired. Not the regular tired of a busy man. Tired in the specific way of someone who had been carrying something they hadn't expected to be heavy. He sat down across from her. He looked at her face. She let him look. "Look. You look—" he started. "Don't," she said. He closed his mouth. A server appeared, asked if he wanted anything. He said coffee, black. The server left. The ambient noise of the coffee shop moved around them. The hiss of the espresso machine. 2 people at a nearby table discussing something about a contractor. The quiet music that was indie folk and slightly too on the nose for the situation. She reached into her bag and put the divorce papers on the table. He looked at them. Looked at her. "I had Claire draw these up," she said. "I want you to read every page." He picked them up. He read with the focused attention he applied to legal documents. Not skimming, not performing, actually reading. She watched his face as he moved through the pages. watched it change in small ways as he absorbed each section. He reached the custody provisions. He stopped, read them twice. "No custody," he said. "No custody," she confirmed. "Noelle. She will carry my family name," she said. "Carter, not Ashcroft." She kept her voice level. "You will have no parental rights. In exchange, I'm not pursuing anything connected to your financial dealings through family court. Whatever happens in federal proceedings happens because of what you built, not because of me." She paused. "I'm also not asking for the house, the accounts, the investments. I want a healthcare provision for her, education through college. That's all." He was very still. "You're leaving money on the table," he said slowly. "I know." "I had attorneys prepare—" "I don't want your money," she said. "I want her to be healthy and educated, and I want my name on her birth certificate, and I want to never have to be in the same room as you again after today." She looked at him directly. "Those are my terms. They're not negotiable." He put the papers down. He looked at his coffee, which had arrived at some point and which he hadn't touched. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. She watched all of this. She was aware of her own heartbeat, not racing, not the adrenaline pattern of someone in danger, just present, the specific beat of a body that had decided something and was living inside the decision. "She looked like you," he said again. Not the controlled version, the same unguarded thing from the hospital doorway, the same thing she'd been trying to categorize for 3 days. "In the hospital, I looked at her and I—" "Don't," she said. He stopped. "That's not what this is," she said. "That's not something you get to use right now." He looked at her. In his eyes, and she had spent 2 years learning his eyes, the specific languages they spoke, something moved that she couldn't fully read and didn't try to. She was done trying to read Damien Ashcroft. He picked up the pen she'd placed beside the papers. "What's her name?" he said. She held the question for a moment. This one, specific question that he had tried to ask in the hospital room and which Mason had prevented. She thought about the name she'd chosen 2 months ago in the hospital break room on a Tuesday between shifts, alone, with a cup of bad coffee and the particular certainty that this part of it, this one part, belonged entirely to her. "Lily," she said. "Lily May Carter." She watched his face. He repeated it softly. Just the name, once, under his breath, like something being memorized or mourned, or both. Then he put the pen to the first signature line and signed. He moved through the document with the same focused attention he'd read it with, each page, each provision, each line requiring a signature. She watched him do it. She was aware of the ambient coffee shop sounds continuing completely indifferently around them. The espresso machine, the contractor conversation, the slightly on-the-nose music. The specific ordinary reality of a public space that had no idea what was being finalized at this particular table. He reached the final page. He signed. He put the pen down. He sat back in his chair and looked at her, and she looked at him, and between them on the table were the signed papers and 2 untouched cups of coffee and the entire weight of something that had been built and had been taken apart and was now finished. She picked up the papers. She straightened them against the table. She put them in her bag. She stood. He stayed seated. She looked at him one last time. This man she had married, this man she had believed in, this man who had touched someone else's hand across a candlelit table while she stood outside in the rain. She looked at him with everything she now understood and without the anger she had expected to feel, because the anger had burned through somewhere in the past 3 days, and what was left underneath it was something quieter and more final. She picked up her bag. "Take care of yourself, Damien," she said. Not warmly, not bitterly. Simply, the way you said things when you meant them factually and had nothing else to add. She walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard his chair not move. She pushed through the glass door and the November air hit her, cold and direct. The specific cold of a city that did not adjust itself to anyone's emotional state. Mason's car was visible at the end of the block. She could see the shape of him behind the wheel. She walked toward it. Her hands were steady. Her heart was doing the regular thing, the specific ordinary beat of a body continuing to function, continuing to move forward, as it had been doing all along even when she hadn't been paying attention to it, even when she'd been standing in rain outside locked doors or lying in hospital beds, or sitting across tables from men who had signed their names to the end of something. She was halfway to the car when her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. "We need to talk." Not Damien's number, not Claire's, not any number she had ever seen. She stopped on the sidewalk. She read it again. She looked back toward the coffee shop. Through the window, she could see Damien still at the table, both hands flat, looking at the surface in front of him. He had not moved. He was not on his phone. She looked at the text again. "We need to talk." And then, a second later, a follow-up message from the same unknown number that made the cold in her chest have nothing to do with November in Chicago. It's about Vivian and what she's been doing without him. She stood on that sidewalk for 11 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. The nurse's habit of tracking time, of anchoring herself to measurable things when the unmeasurable was threatening to take over. The cold moved through her coat. Behind her, the coffee shop window held Damien's silhouette, still seated, still not moving. In front of her, Mason's car idled at the curb. The unknown number on her screen waited. She called Claire. "I just got a text," she said when Claire answered. She read it out loud. Both messages, word for word. A silence on Claire's end that had a specific quality, not surprise, but the particular stillness of someone recalibrating rapidly. "Don't respond," Claire said. "Don't call the number. Where are you right now?" "Sidewalk outside the coffee shop. Mason's across the street." "Get in the car. I'm calling Brennan." She got in the car. Mason looked at her face and said nothing, which was the correct response. He pulled away from the curb smoothly and drove without asking where, because she hadn't told him, and he understood she needed a moment before she could answer that question. She looked at her phone. The two texts were still there on the screen, short and absolute, sitting in a white bubble against gray. "We need to talk. It's about Vivian and what she's been doing without him." Without him. She turned that phrase over in her mind. Not without you. Not behind his back. Without him. Which implied a separation between Damien and Vivian that she had not, until this moment, considered as a genuine possibility. She had understood them as aligned, had built her entire picture of the past 2 years around their alignment, around the idea of two people working in coordinated concert to dismantle her life. The possibility that they were not entirely aligned, that something existed between them that Damien himself didn't know, opened a dimension she hadn't accounted for. Claire called back in 6 minutes. "Brennan wants to know if you're willing to respond to the text under supervision." "Yes," Noelle said. "His office. 1 hour." "Tell him 40 minutes, she said. "I have to stop at the apartment first." She had to feed Lily. That was the reality. Underneath federal investigations and unknown texts and the specific gravity of the morning she'd just had, there was a 10-day-old baby who needed to eat on a schedule that did not adjust itself to the complexity of her mother's circumstances. Mason drove her to the apartment without comment. She went upstairs. Damon was there. He'd been staying most days, managing the logistics of the apartment with the quiet efficiency that was his particular language of care. He looked at her face when she came through the door and said, "What happened?" She told him while she fed Lily. He listened the way Damon listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, assembling the picture in real time. When she finished, he said, "So Vivian has been running something separate." "That's what the text implies." He looked at the baby. "How long?" "I don't know yet." "Does Damien know?" "That's the question." She shifted Lily against her shoulder and felt the baby settle into the specific weight of post-feeding contentment. The person texting seems to think he doesn't, or doesn't know the full extent. Damon was quiet for a moment. "Which means Vivian isn't just the woman who replaced you. She's been using his network for something he didn't sanction." He paused. "Which means he's been played too." She hadn't let herself land on that word yet. Hearing Damon say it made it solid. "Yeah," she said. "How do you feel about that?" She considered the question seriously, the way Damon's questions deserved to be considered. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me after I know what she did." She handed Lily to Damon, who received her with the specific careful competence he brought to everything, and went to change her shirt, and then Mason drove her to the federal building. Brennan had a different room this time. Smaller, no conference table. Just 4 chairs arranged practically, and a recording device on a small stand. Kowalski was there. Claire was there. And a woman Noelle hadn't seen before, introduced as Agent Solis, Financial Crimes Division, who was perhaps 42 and had the particular economy of movement of someone who spent most of her professional life looking at spreadsheets and had developed efficiency as a survival mechanism. They pulled up the unknown number on a laptop while Noelle watched. Brennan said something to Kowalski in a low voice. Kowalski typed. He looked at the screen. He looked at Brennan. "Prepaid," Kowalski said. Bought 6 days ago. Cash. Someone who didn't want to be traced sending a text to someone they needed to reach, Claire said. Someone who knew my number, Noelle said. My personal number, which isn't public. Damien had it, Solis said. It was the first thing she'd said. Yes. Vivian would have had access to his contacts. Solis looked at the screen. Or anyone inside his organization. Brennan said, Ms. Carter, with your permission, we'd like you to respond to the text. Keep it simple. Ask who this is and why they're contacting you. She picked up her phone. She typed, Who is this and why are you texting me? She hit send. They waited. 40 seconds. Then the response came. My name is Daniel Reeves. I was Ashcroft's financial consultant. I think you've heard my name. The room went still in a particular way. Noelle stared at the screen, Elena's voice in the hospital room. His name was Reeves. The legal pad. The word preemptive looked up in a dictionary. The man who had come to the house 4 times in 2 months to meet with Damien in the study. She typed, I've heard it. The response came faster this time, as though he'd been waiting. I need to meet with you in person. What I know about Vivian Laurent is going to matter for what comes next. It matters for you specifically. She looked at Brennan. He was looking at Solis. Something passed between them. The specific shorthand of people who had been working the same case from different angles and had just found an unexpected intersection. Tell him yes, Brennan said. Tell him we'll arrange it. She typed. Reeves agreed. He came in the following morning, not to the federal building, but to a location Brennan arranged, a nondescript office suite in the West Loop that had the specific anonymous quality of a space design not to be memorable. Noelle was there. Claire was there. Brennan and Solis were behind a one-way panel she could see clearly and which Reeves had been told about explicitly because Brennan had insisted on full transparency and Reeves had agreed to it, which itself said something about the nature of what he was carrying and how much he needed it out of his hands. He was 41. He looked older. He had the specific worn quality of a man who had not been sleeping well for an extended period, not the attractive tiredness of someone who worked hard, but the particular erosion of someone who had been managing knowledge that was too heavy to hold and too dangerous to put down. He sat across from her and looked at her for a moment before he spoke. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? She said. Someone more. He stopped. He talked about you like you were fragile, like you were something he needed to manage carefully. She looked at him. He was wrong about that. I can see that. He put his hands flat on the table. What I'm going to tell you, some of it you may already know from other sources. Some of it I don't think anyone knows yet. Then start with what no one knows, she said. He nodded once. He had the manner of someone who had been rehearsing this, who had run through the sequence many times in the sleepless hours, and was now executing the rehearsed version because the alternative was falling apart. He had worked with Damien for 14 months. Legitimately, initially, financial restructuring, which was the polite term for the kind of organizational work that made money move cleanly between sources that weren't entirely clean and destinations that needed to appear legitimate. He was not naive about what he was doing. He had been paid very well not to be naive. Vivian Laurent had been his point of contact. Not Damien, Vivian. She had hired him, had briefed him, had managed the relationship. Damien had been present at meetings, had signed off on strategies, had functioned as the visible authority. But the operational decisions, which accounts received which transfers, which shell structures were layered how, which transactions were timed to coincide with which public filings, those decisions had come from Vivian. She's not his lawyer, Noelle said. She is. Also, he paused. She's also been running a parallel structure inside his network for approximately 2 years. Noelle looked at her hands. 2 years. The length of her marriage. A parallel structure, she said. Accounts he doesn't know about. Companies registered under his network's umbrella that he believes are dormant. Legacy entities from older operations. They're not dormant. He paused. She's been moving money through them, not for his benefit, for hers. How much? He told her. The number was large enough that Claire, who had presumably heard large numbers professionally, made a very small sound that she immediately suppressed. Noelle absorbed it. He doesn't know, she said. He didn't when I last had visibility, which was 3 weeks ago, when I decided I needed to stop having visibility. Reeves looked at his hands. I came to you because I didn't know who else. I couldn't go directly to federal without... I needed someone in the middle who had standing, who had reason to be talking to them already. He met her eyes. I heard through people I know that you'd cooperated, that you'd sat down with Brennan. How did you hear that? Vivian told someone. She was... He stopped. She was not happy about it. She said it was manageable, but she was not happy. Noelle thought about what it meant that Vivian Laurent knew she had sat down with federal agents and had described it as manageable. The specific confidence of that. The assumption that whatever Noelle knew or said could be contained, could be accounted for, could be controlled from a distance by a woman who had been running a parallel financial structure inside a criminal network for 2 years without the network's primary operator noticing. She thought about the custody filing. Leverage, Claire had said, creating legal entanglement. She thought about who had actually wanted that leverage and why. The custody filing, she said. Reeves looked at her. It came from Harmon Doyle, she said. Damien's business legal firm, not his personal attorney. Yes. Vivian is on 3 of the Harmon Doyle client accounts. Yes. Did Damien instruct that filing? A pause. A long one. The specific length of a pause when someone is deciding how honest to be about something that implicates them in additional complexity. No, Reeves said. The room was very quiet. She filed it, Noelle said, using his firm, under his name. She has authority on those accounts. She had authorization, legitimately, to direct legal action on matters pertaining to the network's interests. He looked at the table. She determined that your cooperation with federal agents constituted a threat to the network's interests and took action to create leverage. Without telling him. Without telling him. Noelle sat with that for a long time, longer than was probably comfortable for anyone in the room. She was aware of Claire beside her, aware of the one-way panel and Brennan and Solis behind it, aware of the fluorescent light and the anonymous office, and the worn man across from her who had been carrying this for 3 weeks and had chosen her, specifically, as the person to hand it to. She thought about Damien on the phone. I'm not trying to take her from you. She thought about the confusion in his voice, the specific quality she had categorized as manipulation and was now re-examining. She thought about him sitting in the coffee shop with the papers signed and his hands flat and his face doing the things she couldn't read. And she understood now that what she hadn't been able to read was a man who had also been operating with incomplete information. He had built something. And the person he'd trusted most had been quietly taking it apart for her own purposes, using his infrastructure, his name, his legal authority, while he was focused elsewhere. She almost felt something about that. Almost. Mr. Reeves, she said, are you willing to provide all of this to federal agents directly, on record? Yes, he said. That's why I'm here. She stood. She went to the door. She opened it and said to the hallway, He's ready. Brennan came in with Solis. She went out into the hallway and leaned against the wall and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Claire came out a minute later and stood beside her. You okay? Claire said. She filed the custody claim, Noelle said, against my daughter, without Damien knowing, to protect her own money. She paused. She used my child as a legal instrument to protect money she'd stolen from her own client. Claire was quiet. Yeah, Claire said. Noelle looked at the ceiling for another moment, then she pushed off the wall. What happens now? Reeves testifies. Solis traces the accounts. She already has threads from what Marcus provided. Reeves fills in the gaps. Vivian Laurent is going to have a very significant legal problem very soon. Claire paused. Damien Ashcroft is going to have a significant problem too, but a different one. Reeves's information actually, it separates him somewhat from the parallel structure. He's still liable for what he built and what he knew. But what Vivian did inside it without his knowledge, that's on her. Will it matter, Noelle said, for him, in terms of what he faces? It may reduce certain charges, it won't eliminate exposure. He built the network. He knew what it was. Claire paused. But it matters for context. Noelle thought about Damien's handwriting on the signature lines of the divorce papers. She thought about Lily said softly under his breath in the coffee shop, like something memorized or mourned. She thought about what it meant that the man who had locked her out of her own home had not, in the end, been the one who weaponized her daughter. It didn't make him good. It didn't make her 2 years back. It didn't change any of the marble floors or the candlelit dinners or the hands she wasn't supposed to see. But it was a fact. And she had decided, somewhere in the past 10 days, to deal in facts. Okay, she said. She called Mason. He came and got her. On the drive back to the apartment, she looked out the window at Chicago, the city that had been moving around her continuous and different life for the past 10 days, the city that did not pause for personal devastation or legal proceedings or the specific task of rebuilding a self. She thought about what she needed to do next, and the list was long, but it was finite, which was the important thing. Finite things could be worked through. Finite things had ends. Over the following 3 weeks, Vivian Laurent's financial structure unraveled with the specific speed of something that had been held together by confidence rather than soundness. Solis traced the accounts in 10 days. The documentation Reeves provided filled gaps that made several other threads from investigations Noel had known nothing about, suddenly coherent. Harmon Doyle Associates was served with a federal subpoena on a Wednesday. The firm suspended Vivian's authority the same afternoon. She was arrested on a Thursday morning. Noel heard about it from Claire. She was in the apartment kitchen feeding Lily when the call came, the baby warm and heavy in the crook of her arm, the November light coming through the window in that way it did in the late morning, flat and clear and cold, without drama. "It's done," Claire said. Noel looked at Lily. "What are the charges?" Claire listed them: wire fraud, money laundering, unauthorized fiduciary transactions, 3 counts related to the shell structures, 2 additional counts connected to the custody filing, fraudulent legal representation, specifically using a client's legal authority to pursue personal protective action without disclosure or consent. That last one. She held it. "The custody filing count," she said. "That's because she filed it as Damien's representative without his knowledge." "Without his knowledge or consent," Claire confirmed, "which makes it not only unauthorized but fraudulent. She used his legal standing to protect her own financial interests and called it a family matter." A pause. Prosecutors are not gentle about that kind of thing. Noel was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. "Damien Ashcroft was not arrested that day." His situation moved more slowly through the particular channels that situations involving complex financial networks and partially cooperating principals tended to move through. A negotiation between what he knew and what he was willing to confirm and what could be established without him. Noel did not follow it closely. She followed it enough to know the basic shape of it, because the basic shape of it affected Lily's security provisions, and those she watched with complete attention. But the details of Damien's legal future were no longer her territory. She went back to work 6 weeks after giving birth. Janine, her supervisor, had called twice during the weeks off. Once to check on her, once to say that there was no pressure, no timeline, that her position was held, and her colleagues were managing, and she should take whatever time she needed. Noel had appreciated both calls and had gone back at 6 weeks not because it was required, but because the hospital was one of the few places where she understood exactly who she was and what she was for. She went back on a Tuesday. The morning shift. 7 to 7. She put on her scrubs in the apartment bedroom while Lily slept, and she stood for a moment looking at herself in the mirror over the dresser. 32 years old, which was not old by any measure, but which felt different than 27. Which was how old she had been when she had gone on a night shift and treated a man with a gunshot wound who had arrived in her emergency room and altered the next 5 years of her life. She looked at herself for a long moment, not with vanity and not with judgment, just looking, taking stock. Then she picked up her bag and went to work. Sandra Okafor was at the triage desk when she walked in. Sandra looked at her, and her face did something that was not quite a smile and not quite relief, something that occupied the space between both. "Carter," she said. "Okafor," Noel said. She went to her locker. She put her bag inside. She clipped her badge to her scrubs, the small laminated rectangle with her name and photo and unit designation that she had carried for 4 years. She walked out onto the floor, and the floor received her the way floors received people who knew how to move on them, with the specific ease of a place that recognized a person's particular rhythm. Patricia Holt passed her in the corridor outside room 3 and said, without stopping, "Welcome back." "Good to be back," Noel said, and she meant it. The day moved with the specific compressed quality of hospital time, which was the opposite of the stretched uncertain time of the weeks before. Here, time was structured by need, by patient rotation, by the rhythm of shift handoffs and medication schedules, and the constant calibrated attention to other people's bodies. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, and coming back to it after weeks away felt like putting on something that fit correctly, something whose weight was familiar and manageable. At 2 in the afternoon, she had a 20-minute break. She sat in the break room with a coffee that was bad in the specific institutional way she had missed, and she looked at her phone. A text from Mason. Damon made soup. It's in your fridge. Don't argue. A text from Garrett. Baby monitor battery replaced. You're welcome. A text from Marcus. Nothing. Marcus expressed care through action rather than text, and the action had been the federal call he'd made from a parking structure 3 weeks ago. She looked at the 3 texts and thought about the 4 men who had arrived in 4 vehicles on a storm-soaked night because she hadn't answered a Tuesday phone call, who had sat in hospital waiting rooms and assembled federal documentation and retrieved journals from garages and argued with triage nurses and installed baby monitors and made soup, who had done all of this without asking her to be grateful, without requiring acknowledgement, without making it about anything other than the simple fact that she was their family, and that was what family did. She wrote back to Mason, "Tell Damon thank you, and that I know it has too much garlic." Mason's response came in 10 seconds. He says, "You're welcome," and no, it doesn't. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. 3 months after Lily was born, Noelle went to the cemetery. She went alone. She had told no one she was going, not because it was a secret, but because some things belong to a person individually, and this was one of them. She drove herself, which she had been doing again for 6 weeks, the specific ordinary competence of someone reclaiming the practical dimensions of their life, one by one. She parked and walked the familiar path and stood at her mother's grave in the specific thin brightness of a February afternoon. She had brought the journal. She stood there for a while with it in her hands. The fraying edge on the lower right corner. The brown leather cover, slightly worn at the spine. She opened it to the last page, her mother's handwriting trailing off mid-sentence, the specific pause of a life interrupted before completion. She read her mother's last words again. She came home to 13 years. That blank had been sitting at the end of that sentence for 13 years, and Noelle had never been able to fill it because she hadn't known what came after, hadn't understood what home meant yet, hadn't had the specific experience that would let her complete the sentence honestly. She stood in the cold and thought about what she knew now. She thought about the apartment that was hers, not a compromise with someone else's life, not a temporary arrangement inside someone else's infrastructure, but a place where she had chosen every object, where her mother's painting hung near the window she'd decided to put it near, where Lily slept in a room that Noelle had painted herself on a Saturday afternoon with Garrett, holding the ladder and Mason criticizing her color choice, and Damon quietly doing the edging while no one was paying attention. She thought about Room 7 in Mercy General, about Patricia Holt and Sandra Okafor, and Janine and the bad vending machine coffee, and the fluorescent panel that flickered between 2 and 4 in the morning, and the weight of a newborn placed on her chest by careful hands that knew what they were doing. She thought about 4 vehicles on a storm-soaked night arriving from 4 directions. She thought about Lily's face in sleep, that absolute serenity, that complete trust in the ongoing nature of the world, the specific gift of a person who had not yet accumulated the evidence that would make trust complicated. She opened her pen. She wrote, herself. She came home to herself. She stood there for a while longer. The February cold moved around her without particular malice. Just cold. Just February. Just the specific neutral reality of the world continuing to be the world. She closed the journal. She held it in both hands for a moment, this object that had been in her family for decades, this record of a woman who had lived carefully and loved completely and left a sentence unfinished through no fault of her own. It was finished now. She walked back to her car. Spring came the way Chicago spring always came. Not gently, not as a gradual transition, but in fits and sudden reversals. Warm days interrupted by cold ones. The city's particular stubbornness about releasing winter extended through March and halfway through April, before something finally shifted and the air changed character, and the trees on the residential streets near the apartment began doing their annual transformation. Lily was 4 months old. She had opinions about things. This had become clear in the way it became clear with all babies. Suddenly, as though a switch had been thrown, she had specific preferences and specific objections, and the specific personality of a person who had been in the world long enough to start accumulating responses to it. She liked the particular motion of being carried in the specific carrier Garrett had researched for 2 days before purchasing. She objected to Tuesdays for reasons no one could determine. She had her mother's nose and her grandmother's forehead, and Damon's particular stillness when she was being quietly observant, which was more often than a 4-month-old was expected to be. On a Saturday in late April, Noelle's brothers came over for dinner, all 4 of them. The apartment was not large, but it was hers, and she had learned that the measure of a space was not its size but what happened inside it. She cooked, actually cooked, not reheated, not ordered, but stood in the kitchen she had chosen and made the specific dish their mother had made on Sundays when they were all still at the family table on the south side. The one with the garlic that was always slightly excessive, and which all four brothers always claimed was exactly right. They ate at the table she'd found at an estate sale. Not the same estate sale as the lamp, a different one. A round table that seated 6 if people were willing to be companionable about it, which this family was. The baby was in her carrier against Damon's chest, which she had decided was acceptable. Damon had been confirmed as her second favorite surface, after Noel, which Noel had not told him directly because it would make him insufferable about it. Garrett talked about a project he was working on, a renovation in Bridgeport that had uncovered something structural nobody had accounted for, the way these things always went. Marcus was quiet in his particular way, eating steadily, occasionally making a comment that was 4 words but contained the essential point of a much longer observation. Mason helped her clear the plates without being asked, because Mason always helped clear plates without being asked, and in the kitchen he said quietly, while running water over the dishes, "How are you actually doing? Not the version you tell people." She considered the question. She leaned against the counter and looked at him. This 26-year-old who had been asking this specific question in this specific way her entire adult life, who had never accepted the surface version, who called twice a week and had called twice a week for 13 years. "I don't know yet," she said. "Some days are clear. Some days I think about things I'm not ready to think about yet." "Damien." "Sometimes?" She paused. "The version of him I thought he was. That's the one I think about, not the actual one." Mason turned off the water. He turned to look at her. "That's honest." "I'm trying to be." "You know," he said, "that whoever you were before all this, she's still in there." She looked at him. "I'm not interested in her," she said. She was too willing to not know things. Mason was quiet for a moment. Then something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Okay," he said. "Fair." They went back to the table. At some point the conversation had moved to something Garrett was arguing with Marcus about. Some position Marcus had stated flatly that Garrett found architecturally incorrect, the details of which were both technical and increasingly irrelevant to anyone except the two of them. Damon was watching Lily watch the overhead light with the particular focused attention of someone who has discovered something significant, which to Lily this light clearly was. Noelle looked around the table. She had been here before. At a table like this, with these specific people, the particular noise of 4 brothers who were different in every way that mattered and the same in every way that counted. She had grown up at this table, had left it, had tried to build something separate from it, and had built the wrong thing, had been brought back to this table by the specific event of her own dismantling. She was here now. Not because she'd had no other options, because this was where she chose to be. She picked up her water glass. She looked at Mason across the table. He was watching her the way he always watched her, checking, but without worry now. The checking of someone who sees that the thing they were monitoring has stabilized and is simply maintaining the habit. She raised her glass slightly. He raised his. Nobody made a toast. They didn't need to. Later, after her brothers had gone, and Lily was asleep in her room, and the apartment had the particular quiet of a space that had been full and was now settling, Noelle sat at the kitchen table with her mother's journal. She opened it. Not to the last page. She opened it to the first blank page. The first of the 40% that had been waiting, empty, since her mother had bought it and filled it and then left before she could finish. She had a pen. She thought about what she wanted to write. Not what she should write, not what would make sense to someone reading it later, but what was actually true right now in this kitchen, in this apartment, in this city that had watched her be demolished and had continued moving around her while she rebuilt. She wrote, "Lily slept through the argument about structural integrity. I think she has good instincts." She looked at what she'd written. It was small. It was specific. It was completely true. She kept writing. She wrote about the garlic in the soup. She wrote about the estate sale table and the way Garrett had held the ladder while she painted and criticized the color simultaneously. She wrote about Patricia Holt saying "welcome back" without stopping in the corridor, and the specific weight of those 2 words from someone who didn't waste them. She wrote about standing at her mother's grave in February with a pen and a sentence that had been waiting 13 years to be finished. She wrote until her hand was tired and the kitchen had gone fully dark, except for the lamp on the counter. The one she'd rewired herself from the estate sale, the one whose shape she'd loved, that had traveled with her from the house on Damien's property to this apartment that was hers and sat in the corner of her kitchen looking exactly as it should. She put the pen down. She closed the journal. She sat in the quiet of her apartment and listened to Lily breathe through the monitor on the table. That soft, rapid breath, the specific rhythm of a person who trusted completely that the world would continue to hold while she slept, and who was not wrong about this, because Noelle was in the next room and would continue to hold it as long as holding was possible, and there were 4 men in this city who would back her up. The lamp made a small, warm circle of light. Outside, Chicago moved through its late spring night in the specific way it moved through everything. Without pause, without sentiment, without adjusting itself to the emotional states of the people living inside it. Buses ran. Traffic signals cycled. Someone on the street below was walking fast, and someone else was walking slow, and neither of them knew that in an apartment above them, a woman who had been locked out of her own life on a November night was sitting at a kitchen table with her mother's journal, writing in it for the first time. She had not won cleanly. There was no clean winning, not in the legal sense, where proceedings would extend for months and outcomes were uncertain, and Marcus's career had a specific fragility it hadn't had before, not in the personal sense, where there were still nights when she thought about the version of Damien she had believed in and felt the specific weight of that lost thing, not in any sense that made a tidy narrative. What she had was this: her daughter in the next room, her name on the lease, her hands on the pen, the particular ordinary brightness of a lamp she'd chosen and repaired herself, throwing light into a kitchen that belonged to no one but her. Vivian Laurent's trial date was set for autumn. Reeves had testified to a grand jury. Harmon Doyle Associates had dissolved under the weight of the federal subpoena. Damien Ashcroft had entered a process that would take years to resolve, the specific slow machinery of federal proceedings against complex financial networks. He had sent a letter through his attorney shortly after the divorce was finalized, not to contest anything, not to negotiate, just a letter that Claire had reviewed and cleared and passed on. It said very little. It said he hoped Lily was healthy. It said he intended to honor the financial provisions. It said, at the end, in his specific handwriting that she recognized from 2 years of grocery lists and notes left on kitchen counters. "I'm sorry I didn't see what I had." She had read it once. She had put it in a drawer. Someday, maybe, Lily would want to know something about her father. When that day came, Noelle would tell her the truth, the complete truth, the version that contained his failures and his intelligence, and the way he had said her name softly in a coffee shop like something memorized or mourned. She would not simplify him. She would not protect Lily from the complexity of having been born to someone who was more than one thing. But that was a conversation for years from now. Tonight there was just the lamp and the journal, and Lily breathing through the monitor, and Chicago outside doing what Chicago did, and Noelle Carter, 32 years old, a nurse and a mother and a woman who had learned the specific difference between a life that was given to you and a life you chose, sitting in the quiet of a place that was hers and writing in the blank pages her mother had left her. She turned to a new page. She wrote the date. She began.